very much for inviting me to come here today to talk to you about the health-related quality of life for ME patients. My name is Louise Brinth, and I'm a medical doctor from Denmark. Just a few words of introduction to tell you why I'm standing here today talking to you. I've been a medical doctor for 15 years. I've been in psychiatry, internal medicine, and I'm now specializing in clinical physiology and nuclear medicine. I have for many years had a special interest in the autonomic nervous system, and I know you've already heard about that from Ollie. The autonomic nervous system can be seen as the interface between psyche and soma, and I think that's very interesting because I think most of you know about the controversy about psychosoma and ME. I have evaluated and treated patients with orthostatic intolerance, that's having symptoms when you're upright and feeling better when you lie down again. And on that background, I have seen ME patients. And orthostatic intolerance is, I think, quite important when you talk ME. And as I believe many of you know, the American Institute of Medicine came up with these new guidelines and new diagnostic criteria for ME, where they include orthostatic intolerance as one of 2B criteria. So I believe that you have been told many times this evening what ME is, and you know it already, but just to repeat it, ME is a serious condition with the ICD-10 code of gene 93.3, which places it among the neurological disorders. And it's a syndrome diagnosis, which means that it's given based on symptoms being there and the exclusion of relevant differential diagnosis. And it is called and has been called many, many different names. And I think it's impossible to ascertain to what degree these names, these diagnostic entities, they overlap. There are so many names if you look through the literature. There are also very many diagnostic criteria. Some people say that there are 20. I've heard people mention that we have altogether 100 different diagnostic criteria. And with no clear-cut diagnostic biomarker, this is truly a diagnostic mess. The symptoms reported by ME patients and the symptoms included in the different diagnostic criteria is first and foremost fatigue and post-exertion malaise and post-exertional worsening of all symptoms. And these symptoms are followed by pain, headache, muscle pain, widespread pain. You know all these symptoms, I don't have to repeat them for you. The medical etiology is unclear, that's what we always say. I hope that all of you know that a lot of research is going on, and I think research is accelerating these years. So we have so far got many bits of the puzzle, but we don't have a coherent medical hypothesis so far, but I think we're getting there and we can start combining the dots. But still, both diagnosis and treatment are very challenging, and this is extremely and surprisingly controversial. And I think one of the problems is that ME doesn't have a dedicated medical specialty. You don't know where to go if you have symptoms of ME. But all these symptoms that ME patients mention, they may seem quite common. And this is a rhetorical question, but how many of you have felt fatigued or dizzy or had a headache for the last month? I think most of you had. So what is very important to emphasize is that even though the symptoms may at first hand sound very trivial and very common, this is not a trivial condition. It's not just feeling fatigued. And it's probably also a quite common condition. It's very hard to estimate the prevalence, but a conservative guess would be 0.1 to 0.2% of the population, which will equal about 1/2 to 1 million European citizens having ME. So that's quite a lot. I'm a clinician and a researcher, primarily interested in the autonomic nervous system, but I had the opportunity to co-author this paper on the health-related quality of life for ME patients. And it was first and foremost the work of Michael Hvidberg, is in the picture, and he sends his best regards, and he should have all the credit for this work. We did this study, he did this study, and it was done using two cohorts of subjects. One was 103. Oh, sorry, that's the next slide. The purpose of the study was to describe the health-related quality of life for ME patients and to explore whether the results were influenced by other conditions and to compare the quality of life in ME patients with 20 other conditions, 20 other diagnoses. And this was done with 103 patients recruited through the Danish ME Association and the North Denmark Health Profile Survey, a population sample which was used as the average population in the analysis done in this study. And all these subjects, both patients and the average population, was asked about age and gender and 18 defined self-reported conditions, and also presence of long-term illness, life satisfaction, employment status, and so on. And all the subjects were asked to fill out this questionnaire, EQ5D3L, which is a standardized, non-disease specific instrument used to describe and value health-related quality of life. And it's very standardized. It has been used in more than 100 clinical trials, and it's available in more than 170 official language versions, so it's standardized. And it's got 5 dimensions. You can see them here. The 5 dimensions is mobility, self-care, usual activity, pain and discomfort, and anxiety and depression. And in each of these 5 dimensions, you can rate them in 3 levels. 1 being no problems whatsoever, 2 moderate, and 3 severe problems. So filling out this questionnaire, you've got, if you calculate it, you've got 243 distinct health states possible. That's 3 in the, what do you call it, power of 5. So all these 243 possible ways to fill out this questionnaire gives you a distinct health state. And you can get the score 11111 if you have absolutely no healthcare related problems. And if you're totally disabled and very sick, you'll get the score 3. And then we looked at the raw answers, but we also calculated a linear scale score where you get one number, one score for each patient, where you take the score you have made from this questionnaire and then you convert it into a linear scale ranging from minus 0.6 to 1, where 1 is absolutely perfect health and minus 0.6 is worst possible health, and this scale is anchored around 0, which is death. So it's a bit arbitrary, but if you get a number on this scale that is negative, it means that you have a condition, you have a health-related quality of life that's perceived as worse than death, okay? Which is not good. And then this score is also weighed against your national population reference, so you get the value that equals, if you are living in Denmark and you have this health state, how bad is it? Because if you are Japanese, different things are bad for you than if you are European and if you are Asian, whatever. So this is a Danish ranging of these health states. And this kind of score makes it possible to compare health-related quality of life across different conditions, so you can compare different diagnoses. We found, not surprisingly, that most of the patients were women. We also found that most of the patients reported long-term illness, not a surprise. And we also found that the ME patients reported a higher number of chronic illnesses. They reported a mean of 3 chronic illnesses compared to the average population, who reported 1.3 chronic illnesses on average. We also found that the ME population are significantly higher educated than the average population. So maybe they're not just nicer people, but also better educated people. We found that the ME study population was more disabled and socially marginalized than the average population. They had fewer relationships than the average population, and very high degree of unemployment, with only 8% being employed, and a very high proportion of them on sick leave, and half of them being disability pensioners. When we looked at these 5 dimensions I mentioned, we found that the ME patient differed in all of them, except for the last one, dimension number 5, which was anxiety and depression. We did not find any significant difference between the average population and the ME patients. And I think that's quite an important finding, because I find that many of my colleagues who has no direct interaction with ME patients, they just read about it or hear about it. They think that it mimics depression. But when you see ME patients, when you interact with ME patients, you realize that they're extremely undepressed when you look at how bad they're actually feeling. So I think this is a very significant finding, that they are not more depressed than the average population. 12% of the patients were bedridden, and many of them were unable to perform usual daily activities, and 28% reported being in extreme pain. And I see ME patients, I know this, but I think it's important to get this on a scientific basis and get it written down in a scientific paper, because that's one way of showing the scientific community that this is a severe disease, and it's not just being fatigued. When we looked at this one score that we got from this questionnaire, which could range from minus 0.6 to 1, we found that the average population, they had the most frequent score being 1. So most of the average population, they felt just great, they had no symptoms, and they had a mean score of 0.8, whereas the ME patients had a mean score of 0.4. And you can see that some of the ME patients ranged below 0, meaning that they had a perceived health-related quality of life that was conceived as worse than death. We also adjusted this score for age and gender and education, and also for comorbidities, meaning that we tried to estimate the pure impact of the ME diagnosis on the quality of life of the patients, meaning that we took into account that some of these ME patients also had depression or other diseases. And when we adjusted for that, we got a mean score of 0.5 something. So it didn't change that much. So the ME diagnosis in itself has a very great impact on these patients' life. Yeah. So then we took some of these scores from other conditions, other diagnoses, taken from another recent study done in Denmark. And then we took our findings in the ME patients and compared that to the other conditions. And you can see that you have ME patients up here with a score of 0.47, and you have all these other conditions. And ME patients score the lowest of all these conditions. You've got depression, you've got lung disease, schizophrenia, multiple sclerosis, lung cancer. ME patients score lower, they have a lower health-related quality of life than any of these conditions. Of course, we have several limitations to this study. When you have a disease state that's very hard to delineate, it's very hard to get a diagnosis, it's very hard to find these patients. Then we have this diagnostic mess, and we chose to recruit our subjects through the ME Patient Association in Denmark, which give a quite severe selection bias. On the other hand, we also tried to look at our national registries to see if we could recruit patients through these, seeing patients who had gotten a diagnosis through their physician. And we found that in the time span 1994 to 2013, only 746 patients had been diagnosed with ME in Denmark. And this is surprisingly few patients, and it equals a prevalence of 0.014%. And it's also my clinical experience that it can be almost impossible to be evaluated for ME and to get diagnosed with ME and to be treated for ME in Denmark. So this was the best we could do. And I think one of the strengths of our study is that we have adjusted our numbers, taking into account not just age and gender and education, but also the comorbidity, so that we get this pure effect of ME on the health-related quality of life, and find that it's a very severe disease and has a more severe impact on quality of life than any of the other diagnoses that I mentioned. Well, have other people done this, seeing that it's quite difficult with all the problems about finding the proper way of diagnosing patients? Well, yes, they have. In 1999, Myers and colleagues did a study using the same questionnaire. They used the SHARP criteria. I have never heard of them before. I don't know if any of you had. But it is a quite broad diagnostic criteria, mostly focusing on just being fatigued for a long time. And they found this one score of 0.56, where we found 0.47. So they still find the patients to be very severely affected, just not so severely as we found. In 2001, Hart and Al did a study too, using the SF36 questionnaire, including patients from both UK, US, and Germany. They used the 1994 CDC criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome, and they found that the CFS patients were substantially impaired, and they were equally impaired in all three countries involved in this paper. And in 2011, Nasul et al. Did also a study using the CF36 and found ME patients to have the lowest quality of life score compared to patients diagnosed with cancer, depression, diabetes, heart and lung diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, and also other severe diseases. So these are similar findings to our findings. What are the consequences of this for people? I think it's very important to stress that ME is a chronic disease. I know that some people recover, but most people are chronically ill. I find that some of my colleagues, some of my doctor colleagues, they think that this is just some sort of mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria. And I think it's very important to emphasize that mass hysteria it comes and it goes away again. This is a chronic disease, chronically ill patients. It's not mass hysteria. Most patients never regain their pre-morbid level of health and functioning. Maybe they get a little better, but they don't regain their pre-morbid level of functioning. ME is a severe burden, not just for patients, but also for their caregivers and society as such. It's very difficult to ascertain the burden for society because these patients are to some degree invisible. They are undiagnosed, late diagnosed, misdiagnosed, but it's a great burden. Many live outside society, maybe because they have given up on us as medical professionals. Maybe they don't think we have anything to offer, or they are afraid that what we'll offer them will harm them. And so many patients feel that they are met with skepticism and hostility from healthcare providers, and I think this is quite embarrassing. So, concluding remarks, I don't need to tell you this, but just to tell you what we found. ME is an ill-defined and ill-understood condition. It's a very real condition. The quality of life impact is comparable to that of stroke, multiple sclerosis, heart and lung diseases. It's quite common, it's chronic, it's surrounded by controversy, and we all should have a vested interest in getting wiser and establishing common ground and a shared reality regarding ME. And the patients need to be recognized, respected, and treated. And here you have the cat again.